outside of Bristol, and it's a guy who's a creationist who runs it's a farm converted to a zoo for kids to come, and it's called the Noah's Ark Zoo, and you go there and you see all the 2x2 animals there, and anyway, he knew who I was, and he wanted to make it really clear that he wasn't one of those loony American creationists that think the earth was created 6,000 years ago. No! Adam and Eve were at least 21,000 years ago. And the earth itself was created about 100,000 years ago, so please do not confuse him with one of those goofball, irrational people from America. No. So I thought I'd talk today a little bit about, I'll do some partial reading from the book and then just tell some stories about Darwin and talk about the theory a little bit. So I opened the book with the prologue of a little story when I went to the Galapagos with my friend Frank Sulloway, who's a Darwin scholar and an evolutionary biologist. So I'll start there. In June 2004, the science historian Frank Sulloway and I began a month-long expedition to retrace Charles Darwin's footsteps in the Galapagos Islands. It turned out to be one of the most physically grueling experiences of my life, and as I have raced a bicycle across America, that is saying something special about what the young British naturalist was able to accomplish in 1835. Charles Darwin was not only one sagacious scientist, he was also one tenacious explorer. I fully appreciated Darwin's doggedness when we hit the stark and barren lava fields on the island of San Cristobal, the first place Darwin explored in the archipelago. With a sweltering equatorial sun and almost no fresh water, it's not long before water-loaded 70-pound packs begin to buckle your knees and strain your back. Add hours of daily bushwhacking through dense, scratchy vegetation, and the romance of field work quickly fades. At the end of one 3-day excursion, my water supply was so dangerously low that Frank and I collected the dew that had accumulated on the tents the night before. One day I sliced my shin on a chunk of lava. Another day I was stung by a wasp and one side of my face nearly doubled in size. At the end of one particularly grueling climb through a moonscape-like area Darwin called the Craterized District, we collapsed in utter exhaustion, muscles quivering and sweat pouring off our hands and faces, after which we read from Darwin's diary, in which the naturalist described a similar excursion as a long walk. Of course, he was 25 and I was 50, so I cut myself a little slack. Death permeates these islands. Animal carcasses are scattered everywhere. The vegetation is coarse and scrappy. Dried and shriveled cactus trunks dot the bleak landscape. The lava terrain is so broken with razor-sharp edges that progress across it is glacially slow. Many people have died there, from stranded sailors of centuries past to wanderlust-driven tourists in recent years. Within days, I had a deep sense of isolation and fragility. Without the protective blanket of civilization, none of us are far from death. Of course, we had a satellite phone, just in case. With precious little water and even less edible foliage, organisms eke out a precarious living, their adaptations to this harsh environment selected over millions of years. A lifelong observer of and participant in the evolution-creation controversy, I was struck by how clear it is in these islands. Creation by intelligent design is absurd. So how then did Darwin depart the Galapagos a creationist? So it's an interesting story. When did Darwin become an evolutionist? The theory of evolution has been around for a while. There was no mechanism for it. And therefore scientists generally are reluctant to accept a new theory until there's some mechanism for it. Lots of people had speculated about, it looks like the continents may have once been together. It kind of looks like pieces of a puzzle, but scientists until the 1960s said, but what could possibly drive a continent to move? So there has to be some other explanation until there was finally a mechanism. So without a mechanism, the theory of evolution was just speculative, and creationism, that is, whatever the creator was, the fixed essentialism of an organism stays that way. It's non-changeable. That is what everybody believed, from Aristotle all the way up. A dog is, it's got fur and a curly little tail and floppy ears and it barks, and it's not going to become a cat. And variations on the theme are just that. They're just varieties. And any kind of pre-Darwinian selections you find in naturalist writings are typically really talking about nature selecting against those varieties that are too far away from the created kind, the essence. So you could still describe a population of an organism in a bell-shaped curve, But it's in that, between the two standard deviations, that's where the essence is. And all the little varieties out here, they usually die. They don't make it. And the reason for that is because they have to stay the same. They are what they are by definition, and they can't change. Ultimately, that's what everybody believed. And it was not until Darwin figured out how to turn that upside down and say, no, that selective process that we've all talked about actually works to create new kinds. That's the essence of the theory. But he didn't figure that out on the Galapagos. He didn't figure that out on the 5-year voyage Beagle. He didn't figure it out on the way home. I don't think he figured it out till he was already home. One reason I realized when I was there with Frank is that, the sun comes up at 6 a.m., it's right on the equator, and the sun goes down at 6 a.m., and it's hotter than hell, and it's dry, and it's hard work, and by the time you're done, the sun goes down, you eat, and you just go to sleep. There's no time for speculative thinking of science and religion and theory and all this stuff. You just are pooped. So I think he didn't figure it out because he really hadn't the time or energy to think about it until he got home. Now, there are some people who speculate about what he meant by this passage or that passage. One of them, for example, I'll read you. This was 9 months after departing the Galapagos in his ornithological catalog about his mockingbird collection. When I see these islands inside of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds, but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties. So, at least one scientist, a fairly prominent one, has said, see, he's suspicious. No, suspect means I think that. I suspect that these are only varieties. See, he's still saying these are just varieties. They're not becoming a new kind. It isn't until he gets home that he takes his specimens to the famous ornithologist John Gould and says, what are these? I think they're this. And he says, no, actually, they're not that. They're this. And I hope you collected which island you got them from, because that would be really interesting to know. And he said, well, no, I didn't. You see, if you were an evolutionist and you'd already come up with the idea of adaptive radiation and the idea that a species lands on an island and then it radiates out to the other islands and becomes different, then you want to know which island each of your specimens came from. He didn't record those. In fact, he even recorded in his notebook that the local governor, the British governor of the islands, had commented to him that he could tell by the carapace of the tortoises, the shells, which island they came from. He could just look at one and go, oh, that's from whatever island. And Darwin wrote that down as just sort of an interesting tidbit, and they collected lots of tortoises on the Beagle and took them back with them, not as collections, but as fresh meat on the hoof, and they ate them. So Darwin ate his data and threw the shells overboard. That's how we know he was still a creationist. Until he got home. Then he started to piece it all together into the late 30s. He opened notebooks. 1842 he wrote an essay. 1844 he wrote another long letter to a colleague, basically outlining his ideas. It was like 224 pages long. This is a long letter. They wrote long letters back then. And that's how he sort of pieced it together. He didn't publish for several reasons for a long time. People always ask, how come it took him 20 years to publish after he figured it out? Well, because he was still relatively young and unknown, not completely unknown, but not well established in scientific circles to write a big theory of everything book. Scientists mostly frown upon people that write big theories of everything until they've paid their dues and shown that they're actually really working scientists, and maybe toward the end of your career you write the big book, something like that. And in fact, there was an anonymously published book called The Vestiges of Creation, turned out to be by a guy named Robert Chambers, but this was yet another one of these speculative evolution books that had no mechanism for what would cause species to change. And so this book was panned by the scientific critics, and Darwin thought, and his mentors told him, don't do that, because that could be embarrassing for your career. Your career will stall. So instead he wrote a 3-volume monograph on barnacles. And very detailed, specific work, basically paying his dues. And he would have gone on doing that for probably another decade had he not gotten this letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who Liam kindly mentioned that I wrote my dissertation on. I really would have loved to write something on Darwin, but it is such a saturated market in the business, so to speak. There's such an industry of Darwinian that there isn't as much new ground to plow there. So I did something on Wallace, who had already independently figured it out himself, much later than Darwin, but on his own, and wrote it all down in this essay with a cover letter